What if the most powerful moment in the entire 24 hours, for aligning yourself with the flow of abundance, the moment the ancient sages identified as the one time each day when the gates of provision open widest, is not the morning, not the marketplace, not the hours of greatest effort and activity, but the last few minutes before you surrender to sleep? And what if there is a prayer, specific, ancient, precisely constructed, that Jewish tradition has preserved for exactly this moment? A prayer that is not merely asking for things, a prayer that, when understood in its full depth, is a technology, a precise spiritual technology for preparing the consciousness of the sleeping person to receive, during the hours of the night, the alignment, the clarity, and the opening of channels that the waking mind, burdened by anxiety, by calculation, by the noise of the day, is too contracted to receive. Tonight, I am going to reveal this prayer, where it comes from, what the sages said happens when it is recited with genuine understanding in the moments before sleep, and what you must understand about the night itself, about what the Jewish mystical tradition teaches is happening in the hours of sleep, in order to use this prayer as it was intended to be used. Stay with me, because this teaching begins not with a text, but with a question that the tradition considers one of the most important questions a person can ask. What is sleep? We begin in the city of Mezeritch, in the Ukraine, in the year 1766. Rabbi Dov Ber of Mezeritch, known in the Chassidic world as the Great Maggid, the Great Preacher, had become, in the years following the death of the Baal Shem Tov, the leader of the entire Chassidic movement. Students came to him from every corner of the Jewish world, from Poland and Lithuania, from Galicia and Hungary, from the furthest reaches of the diaspora, to learn what the Baal Shem Tov had taught and what the Maggid himself had deepened. But the Maggid was not primarily a preacher in the ordinary sense. He was a teacher of the inner life. His genius was the ability to take the most abstract teachings of Kabbalistic philosophy and locate them in the body, in the breath, in the daily rhythms of waking and sleeping, of eating and resting, of the ordinary human life lived with full spiritual attention. One of his closest students, a young man named Rabbi of Karlin, had come to Mezeritch with a question that had been consuming him for months. Rabbi was a man of extraordinary spiritual intensity. His prayers were said to shake the walls of whatever room he prayed in, and his love of God was described by those who witnessed it as something almost beyond what ordinary human vessels could contain. And yet he came to the Maggid with a question about money. He was ashamed of the question, he admitted, a man of his spiritual orientation, troubled by something so material. But the Maggid looked at him with those eyes, deep, patient, amused in the way that genuine wisdom is always slightly amused by the distinctions lesser minds draw between the sacred and the ordinary, and said, "Ask the question. There are no unspiritual questions. There are only unspiritual answers." Rabbi asked, "Why, when I pray for provision, honestly, sincerely, with my whole heart, does it seem that my prayers reach a certain height and no further? As if there is a ceiling I cannot penetrate. I give to tzedakah, I study, I pray with full intention, and yet the household struggles. What am I not understanding about the relationship between prayer and provision?" The Maggid was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do you pray for provision?" Reb Aharon told him, "In the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, at every point the tradition prescribes." The Maggid nodded. "And what do you do before you sleep?" Reb Aharon thought for a moment. He described his bedtime practice, the Shema, the standard night prayers, a brief accounting of the day. Standard practice, sincere, but brief. The Maggid said, "You are praying at all the right times, but you are missing the most important time, and you are missing it not because you are careless, but because no one has taught you what the night is for." He then gave Reb Aharon a teaching about sleep, about the night, and about the specific prayer that belongs in the final moments before sleep, that has remained one of the most powerful and least widely known practices in all of the Chassidic tradition. What the Maggid taught that evening was this: the Kabbalistic tradition teaches that the human soul does not remain fully within the body during sleep. During the hours of genuine deep sleep, the soul ascends, rises to levels of the spiritual world that are inaccessible to the waking consciousness, which is too busy, too engaged with the practical management of physical reality to open itself to what those levels offer. And during this nightly ascent, the soul encounters, in a way that the waking mind cannot fully grasp or articulate, the source of provision, the channels through which blessing flows, the specific openings and blockages in the spiritual structure of the person's life. This is why, the Maggid taught, the dreams of a righteous and spiritually attentive person are not merely the random noise of an unoccupied mind. They are the returns, the echoes of what the soul encountered during its nightly ascent. They carry information. They carry guidance. They carry, sometimes, the specific clarities that the waking mind has been struggling to reach and cannot. But the capacity of the soul to rise fully during sleep, to encounter what it needs to encounter, and to bring back what the waking life needs, this capacity is not automatic. It depends on the state in which the person enters sleep. The person who goes to sleep carrying unresolved anger, unacknowledged guilt, the accumulated anxiety of a day spent in contracted fear, that person's soul ascends from a compromised vessel, and what it brings back is compromised accordingly. And this is where the prayer comes in. The Maggid taught Rebbe Haran that the purpose of the bedtime prayer is not primarily petitionary. It is not primarily about asking for things. Its primary purpose is to prepare the vessel, to clear the soul of the specific residues of the day that would otherwise limit the quality of its nightly ascent, so that what the soul encounters during sleep and what it brings back into the waking life is as full and as clear and as unobstructed as possible. The prayer he prescribed draws from several layers of the Jewish night prayer tradition, from the Kedusha de Sidra of the evening service, from the bedtime Shema, from the confessional prayers of the Musar masters, and from a specific edition that the Baal Shem Tov himself is said to have composed for the moments of transition between waking and sleep. The prayer has 5 parts, and each part addresses one of the 5 specific residues that the Kabbalists identified as the most common and most powerful obstructions to the soul's nightly ascent. The first part is the release of grievance. The Maggid taught that nothing obstructs the soul's ascent more reliably than unresolved grievance, the low-grade, often barely conscious resentment toward another person that a person carries through their days without addressing. Not dramatic hatred, not the sharp pain of fresh betrayal, but the accumulated, quietly fermenting resentment that grows from small slights never addressed, from disappointments never spoken, from the slow erosion of goodwill that happens when what bothers us is never brought into the open. This residue, the Kabbalists taught, is spiritually very heavy. It binds the soul to the level of ordinary human grievance and prevents it from rising to the level where genuine provision and clarity live. And the first thing the bedtime prayer must do is release it. The release is not forgiveness in the sentimental sense, the pretending that something did not happen, the forcing of a feeling that is not genuinely present. It is something more precise and more demanding. It is the deliberate act of deciding that this person, whoever they are, whoever said or did what they said or did today, this week, this month, will not be carried into the night. That the soul going into its ascent will go unencumbered by the weight of what was done to it. That the accounting with that person, whatever it requires, will happen in waking life, through honest conversation, through appropriate action, but that it will not be carried into sleep. The Maggid gave Reb Aharon a specific formula for this part of the prayer. He said, before you sleep, name, inwardly, silently, specifically, any person toward whom you are carrying grievance, however small. Name them, And then say in your own words, in the language of your own heart, I release you from my night. I will deal with what is between us when I am awake, but tonight my soul goes forward without this weight. You are released from my night. The second part is the accounting of the day. The Musar tradition calls this practice cheshbon ha-nefesh, the accounting of the soul. And the Maggid taught that the bedtime version of this practice is not the same as the extended systematic self-examination that the Musar masters prescribed for weekly or monthly review. It is faster, it is lighter, it is not a trial, but a glance, a brief, honest turning of the attention backward over the day just ending, and the honest naming of one moment in which the person fell short of their own values. Not in shame, not in self-punishment, but in the clean, honest acknowledgement that is the necessary precondition of genuine improvement. The Kabbalists taught that the soul ascending into sleep carrying unacknowledged failures is like a vessel carrying a crack it does not know about. The crack does not prevent the vessel from rising, but it limits what the vessel can hold when it descends. What clarity, what insight, what opening it can carry back into the waking life, and the act of honest acknowledgement, however brief, however painful, seals the crack. Not by erasing what happened, but by bringing it into consciousness, where it can begin to be addressed. The third part is gratitude, but a very specific form of gratitude that is different from the general gratitude practice of the morning or the meal. The bedtime gratitude the Maggid taught is specifically about provision, about looking back over the day and naming, specifically, concretely, the evidence that the source of provision was present and active. Not the large evidence, the small evidence, the meal that was on the table, the transaction that went better than feared, the unexpected resource that appeared at the moment it was needed, the soul ascending into sleep in a state of acknowledged gratitude for specific evidence of provision ascends from a different position than the soul that goes into sleep, still uncertain whether the source is present. The soul that has named the evidence, that has said inwardly, specifically, I saw provision today, here, and here, goes into its ascent already partially opened to what it is rising toward. And partially opened is infinitely better than fully closed. The fourth part is the planting of the specific request. This is the petitionary dimension of the prayer, the part where what is needed and wanted is brought before the source. But the Maggid taught that this part has a very specific quality that distinguishes it from ordinary petitionary prayer. He said, do not bring a list. Do not arrive before the source of provision with a catalog of needs and wants spread out like a merchant displaying wares. Bring one thing, the one thing that, if it opened, would open everything else. The one blockage that, if cleared, would allow the rest to flow. The one need that sits closest to the center of the current situation. Name it specifically. Name it honestly, not as you wish it were, but as it actually is. And then, having named it, release it, not in resignation, not in the pretending that you do not care what happens, but in the genuine, practiced trust that the source has heard, that the soul ascending during the coming night will carry this specific request to the level where it can be received and addressed, and that what returns in the morning, in the form of clarity, of new perception, of a path that was not visible the night before, will be the response. The fifth and final part is the surrender itself. The Maggid taught that most people enter sleep without truly surrendering to it. They lie down, they close their eyes, but some part of them, the anxious, calculating, managing part that has been working all day, does not stop. It continues to turn the day's problems, to rehearse tomorrow's challenges, to run the scenarios of what might go wrong. And this part, by continuing to work, prevents the soul from completing its ascent. It holds the soul in the world of ordinary human calculation precisely when the soul needs to rise beyond it. The final part of the prayer is the deliberate act of surrendering this, of saying to the managing mind, "You have worked today. You have done what you can. Now it is not your turn. Now the soul goes where the mind cannot follow, and what returns in the morning will be more than what the mind alone could produce." The Maggid gave Reb Aharon one phrase for this surrender, from Psalm 31, composed by King David in the hours of the night when the ordinary mind is stilled and deeper awareness opens. "Into your hand I commit my spirit." 4 words. Not the dramatic surrender of a crisis, the quiet, daily, practiced surrender of a person who has learned that the night is not empty and that the soul that ascends unencumbered returns with more than it carried when it left. Reb Aharon of Karlin returned to his home with this teaching and began the practice that very night. He performed the 5 parts in sequence. He named the grievances of the day and released them from his night. He looked back honestly and named the moment he had fallen short. He named 3 specific pieces of evidence that provision had been present in the day. He brought his one specific request, which was not, he realized as he searched for it, about money at all, but about a relationship in his household that had become strained and whose tension was, he now understood, one of the channels through which the anxiety about provision was actually flowing. And then he surrendered, 4 words from Psalm 31, held genuinely rather than recited automatically, and allowed himself to sleep. He described what followed in a letter to a fellow student preserved in the Chassidic literature. He wrote that he did not experience a sudden change in his material circumstances. What changed was his waking perception. He began to see the connection between the strained relationship he had named in his specific request and the ways its tension had been quietly undermining his confidence and clarity in his daily dealings. He addressed the relationship. It began to heal. And as it healed, something that had been contracted in him, in his presence, in his dealings, in the quality of his engagement, began to open. 3 months after beginning the practice, he wrote, "I do not know whether the provision came because the prayer opened something, or whether the prayer opened something and the provision followed as a natural consequence. The Maggid would say these are the same statement. I begin to believe he is right." That is the teaching of the bedtime prayer. 5 parts, each one addressing a specific residue that obstructs the soul's nightly ascent, each one preparing the vessel of the sleeping person to receive what the night, properly entered, can offer. Release the grievances of the day, name them specifically, and let them go until morning. Account for the day honestly. Name one moment of falling short, not in shame, but in the clean acknowledgement that makes genuine improvement possible. Name 3 specific evidences of provision in the day just ending. Not large miracles, the small, present, specific evidence that the source was active today. Bring your one most central request. Name it specifically and honestly. Then release it to the ascending soul. And surrender. Into your hand I commit my spirit. 4 words. Genuinely held every night. This is not a complex practice. It takes perhaps 5 minutes. It can be done in bed, in the dark, in the language of your own heart, without any external tools or preparations. What it requires is only honesty and the willingness to do it consistently, not once, not when you remember, but every night, as reliably as you close your eyes. The tradition does not promise that the practice produces immediate external results. What it promises, and this promise has been confirmed by generation after generation of practitioners, is that the person who enters sleep this way, night after night, gradually and reliably becomes a different person. A person whose soul has been rising more fully, returning more clearly, bringing back night after night the small increments of insight, clarity, and opened perception that accumulate over months and years into a life that is genuinely and measurably different from the one that was being lived before. And a different person, as the tradition has always taught, lives in a different relationship with abundance. Not because the world has changed, because the vessel has. Subscribe to this channel. Each week, I bring you another piece of this living and extraordinary inheritance, the wisdom of Torah, the teachings of the Chassidic and Kabbalistic masters, the ancient practices of the inner Jewish tradition that have carried families through every form of difficulty into lives of meaning, wholeness, and enduring abundance. And in the comments below, tell me, which of the 5 parts of this prayer do you think will be hardest for you? The release of grievance, the honest accounting, the gratitude, the specific request, or the surrender? Tell me where you expect the resistance to live, because knowing where the resistance is itself the beginning of the work. The night is not empty. It never was.